Welcome to the Appalachian Historical Review. This is the audio home for AppalachianGenealogy.com. Each week, we dig into the records, migration paths, and the real stories of the people who settled the Appalachian Range. We're here to look at the actual documents and the everyday lives that define our heritage. Now, let's step into the records and look at what the documents themselves reveal.
Picture this, right? You're tracing your family tree.
Oh, yeah, a lot of people are doing that these days.
Exactly. And you've spent months just digging through archives, following the life of a female ancestor. Let's say it's your great-great-grandmother, straight through the mid-19th century.
Right.
You see her listed in the 1870 census. You locate her marriage certificate in some dusty county ledger. You even spot her name on a few property tax records alongside her husband's.
So you've got a really solid paper trail going.
Yeah, you're building this vivid picture of her life.
Yeah.
And then she just vanishes.
Just completely evaporates. I mean, no death certificate, no burial record, no subsequent census data at all.
Right. So naturally, you start asking around.
Mm-hmm.
You dig into the oral history. Maybe you ask an older relative, and they give you this really vague, kind of hushed answer.
Like, oh, she got sick and went to stay with folks downstate.
Yes. Or just, she went away.
Mm-hmm.
And on the surface, I mean, it sounds like a tragic but fairly normal historical footnote. People moved, people passed away unrecorded.
Yeah. Sure, record keeping wasn't perfect.
Exactly. But the truth of where she actually went and the bureaucratic machinery that put her there is a profound and honestly deeply unsettling historical silence.
It really is. Because in many of these cases across Appalachia, she didn't just wander off. She was legally erased from her own life.
And that is the focal point of our deep dive today. We are sorting through this massive stack of historical sources, academic papers, genealogical records, legal archives, to really uncover how 19th and early 20th century Appalachian women were committed to lunacy asylums.
For what were essentially everyday conditions.
Right. We're going to examine the doorway they were pushed through, the gendered medical theories that are weaponized against them, and why women in these specific mountain communities were just so incredibly vulnerable.
And most importantly, I think, we'll look at the unique paper trail they left behind and how you can actually find these vanished women today.
Yeah, it's going to be a really intense journey. But to understand how these women disappeared from the public record, we first have to look at the doorway itself.
Yeah, the process of commitment. Because, if you think about the concept of involuntary psychiatric holds today, you immediately picture doctors.
Right. Clinical evaluations, hospitals, white coats.
Exactly. But that was entirely absent here.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is the part of the research that completely stopped me in my tracks.
Yeah.
The doorway to the asylum in 19th century Appalachia, particularly in states like West Virginia, it was not a medical doorway.
No, it was an administrative legal process.
I mean, it's like a modern-day neighborhood dispute suddenly gaining the power of medical incarceration.
That's a great way to put it. They utilized this system known as a lunacy commission. And the shocking thing is that this commission operated independently of any medical oversight, or even a formal judge, usually.
Wait, really? No judge?
Nope. It was typically chaired by the clerk of the county court and the local prosecuting attorney.
Let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. So if you were a listener living in, say, 1880s Appalachia, a bad argument with your neighbor over a property line or a shouting match with your spouse could literally end with a county clerk deciding your medical fate.
That's exactly what could happen.
How does a bureaucrat get that kind of power? Like, how are they deemed qualified to diagnose sanity?
Well, it stems from a legal doctrine called parens patriae, which translates from Latin to parent of the nation.
Parent of the nation, okay.
Right. It's this foundational concept that the state has an inherent protective authority over citizens who cannot protect themselves.
So the state steps in to be the parent.
Exactly. In theory, it's designed to care for the vulnerable. But in practice, especially in these rural commissions, the system prioritized social containment over medical treatment.
Oh, I see.
The state was essentially stepping in to manage anyone deemed a public nuisance or a domestic disruption. And they used incredibly low standards of evidence.
And the threshold for triggering that state intervention was terrifyingly low.
Yeah.
I mean, the process just started with a single sworn complaint.
Right, just one piece of paper.
Any adult, a husband, a father, or even just an annoyed neighbor, could walk into the county courthouse and file a petition claiming a woman was, quote, insane or distracted.
And once that complaint was filed, the clerk issued a warrant.
A warrant, like an arrest warrant.
Literally an arrest warrant. The county sheriff would physically arrest the accused woman, And she wouldn't be taken to a clinic. She was often held in the local county jail.
That is wild.
Yeah, locked in a cell right alongside criminal suspects, simply waiting for an informal hearing.
So she's sitting in a jail cell, waiting for a hearing run by a prosecutor.
Yes.
And at this hearing, they aren't bringing in neurological experts.
Not at all.
They're relying heavily on lay testimony from the very people who might have a grudge against her. Like a neighbor says, I saw her crying in the yard. Or a husband testifies, she refuses to do her chores.
Right. And you have to remember, statutorily, women could not serve on juries or hold these clerk positions back then.
Of course not.
So the entire evaluative body assessing this woman's behavior and her biological functions was, by law, comprised entirely of men who had no medical training whatsoever.
It's just a recipe for disaster.
Completely. The standards of evidence were incredibly loose. The woman rarely had legal representation. The commission's focus was really largely on whether her behavior was socially unacceptable rather than fitting any rigorous clinical criteria.
And if they decided she was a lunatic?
They executed a formal commitment order.
At which point the sheriff puts her in a wagon, sometimes physically manacled, and ships her off to a massive centralized state hospital miles away. Places like the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum.
Yeah, far away from anyone she knew.
So since these local laymen were essentially crowdsourcing a medical diagnosis, we have to look at what exactly they considered insane behavior for a woman at the time.
We really do.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you look at the gender diagnoses prevalent in 19th century medical theory, it's mind-blowing what found its way into these Appalachian courtrooms.
Right. You don't see modern psychiatric terms in the admission registers from this era?
No, it's like a modern doctor prescribing a straitjacket simply because a woman has PMS or is going through menopause. It's just pathologizing basic female biology.
Absolutely. The diagnostic categories are staggering.
Yeah, the sources list things like menstrual insanity.
Right.
And puerperal insanity, which today we would recognize as postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis.
Exactly.
They listed climacteric insanity for women going through menopause. And of course, the ever-present catch-all diagnosis of hysteria, not to mention moral insanity.
What's fascinating here is the underlying mechanism for why doctors believed these were legitimate mental illnesses. It's crucial context.
Break that down for us because it sounds so bizarre now.
Well, 19th century neurology operated on this finite nerve energy theory.
Finite nerve energy.
Yeah. They genuinely believed the human body possessed a limited battery of nervous energy.
Like a literal battery.
Exactly like that. And in their view, the female reproductive system was so demanding that during menstruation, pregnancy, or menopause, the uterus and ovaries would essentially hijack all the available energy from the brain.
So in their minds, a biological function was literally unplugging a woman's rationality.
Uh-huh.
Because her battery was drained.
That is precisely the framework they were operating within. It's sort of a modernized version of the ancient wandering womb theory.
Wow.
And because there were very few highly trained alienists, which is the Victorian term for psychiatrists in these remote mountain counties, the local general practitioners didn't have the specialized knowledge to challenge this.
They just went along with it.
Yeah, they simply repeated these prevailing national theories rather than conducting meaningful evaluations, If a woman was exhibiting distress and happened to be of childbearing age, the biological function itself was labeled the culprit.
Which meant everyday emotional triggers were easily weaponized against women. Like, the records show women committed because their so-called insanity was triggered by grief over the death of a child.
Which is just a normal human reaction.
Completely normal. Or a severe marital conflict. I read one source that listed novel reading and seduction as the official reasons for a woman's commitment.
And you see this cultural bias perfectly reflected in the exact language used in the county court minutes. The Appalachian records aren't filled with clinical Latin terminology.
No, they're full of regional vernacular.
Exactly. You read testimony from neighbors saying a woman takes spells, or she gets wild-like when her time of the month comes, or she just goes off in her head.
A jury of 12 local men would hear that she takes spells, apply that finite energy theory, and declare her legally insane. It was a highly effective pseudoscientific vocabulary for turning social nonconformity into a medical emergency.
It really was. But this brings up a critical question, I think.
What's that?
If these biological theories were accepted across the entire country, why were Appalachian women specifically so vulnerable? What made the mountains different from, say, a city in New England?
Well, the sources point to a devastating collision of geography, law, and economics. Let's start with the geography.
The rural isolation.
Yes, the profound rural isolation of the Appalachian Hollows. It meant a woman's behavior was judged entirely by a microscopic, tight-knit circle of kin and neighbors.
Right. In an urban center, if you clash with your neighbors or your spouse, you have varying degrees of social mobility.
You could just leave or find a new friend group.
Exactly. You can seek a second opinion from a different doctor. But in the remote mountains, if those specific local relationships soured, or if a woman became an outcast within that one small community, accusations of lunacy could escalate rapidly.
We absolutely no outside intervention.
Nowhere to run.
And layered on top of that physical isolation is the legal framework of the era. Specifically, the common law doctrine of coverture.
Coverture, this is huge.
Yeah, it dictated that a woman's legal rights were essentially suspended the moment she got married. Her legal identity was, quite literally, covered by her husband's.
Under coverture, a husband assumed absolute control over his wife's personal property, her real estate, and her legal existence in the eyes of the court.
So what does this all mean for the women who actually owned land or had an inheritance? Were they essentially sitting targets for greedy relatives?
They absolutely were. But there's a vital distinction in the law to understand here. He controlled the use of the property, but he couldn't legally sell or liquidate her inherited land without her signature.
Ah, okay. So she still held the ultimate title to her family inheritance.
Right. So if an Appalachian husband wanted to sell 50 acres of his wife's timberland to a coal company, and she refused to sign the deed, he was stuck.
But a commitment order changes that.
Yes, it does. A declaration of lunacy stripped the woman of her competency. The court would then appoint a legal guardian, often the husband himself. And with that guardianship, he gained the legal power of attorney to liquidate her assets completely without her consent.
The sources refer to this as the madhouse divorce, because absolute divorce was exceptionally difficult to obtain under 19th century Appalachian statutes. You couldn't just cite irreconcilable differences.
No, it was nearly impossible.
So civil commitment became a terrifyingly convenient loophole. A husband could effectively dissolve the practical constraints of the marriage, remove an unhappy wife from the home, and gain unquestioned power to sell her estate.
It was a brutal system, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to introduce some nuance.
Right, because it wasn't always just evil husbands.
Exactly. If we only view this through the lens of patriarchal malice with, stealing timber and all that, we miss a massive portion of the historical truth. Appalachia was an impoverished agrarian society.
Right. If you don't work, the family doesn't eat.
Survival depended on the intense physical labor of every single family member, from sunrise to sunset. So consider a family on the brink of starvation. If a mother develops severe, debilitating postpartum depression or a grandmother suffers from dementia, the family simply cannot afford the labor costs of keeping someone home to care for them.
They have no financial safety net at all.
None. In these desperate scenarios, the civil commitment process wasn't utilized out of malice. It was a brutal socioeconomic survival mechanism. The state hospital functioned as a free, state-sponsored shock absorber for families pushed to the absolute edge.
So it wasn't always a calculated theft of a life. Sometimes it was a family making an impossible, agonizing choice just to keep the rest of their children from freezing or starving.
Exactly. But regardless of the motive, whether it was to control property, punish a rebellious wife, or survive grinding poverty, the outcome was identical.
Yeah.
The woman was removed from her community, stripped of her legal rights, and placed in a locked institution.
And this devastating intersection of property theft, geographic isolation, and legal erasure left behind a very specific kind of paper trail, one that modern descendants are just now learning how to read.
Because families were so desperate to hide this reality, right?
Yeah. Right. The stigma surrounding mental illness in these tight-knit mountain communities was immense. It meant families intentionally created narrative gaps.
Mental illness, or even just institutionalization for poverty, was viewed as a moral failing. It was a taint on the family bloodline that could literally ruin the marriage prospects of the remaining children.
So families used euphemisms. Like we mentioned earlier, she stayed with folks downstate or she went to the hospital. They purposefully disguised long-term removal,
which resulted in generations of profound silence in family lore.
So trying to track these women through the archives isn't like finding a standard medical file. It's more like dusting for fingerprints at a historical crime scene. You aren't looking for what's written, you're looking for the shape of the blank spaces.
Genealogists actually call it solving census disappearances.
Yeah, explain how that works in practice.
Well, you're tracking a family decade by decade. In the 1870 census, the mother is present in the household. But in the 1880 census, she's just gone.
Usually, you'd assume she died.
Right, but if you know how the system functioned, you don't assume that. You search the centralized state hospital schedules for that census year, and often, there she is.
Listed hundreds of miles away from her children.
Sometimes even across state lines, categorized simply as an inmate.
And because patients from several remote mountain counties were funneled into a single centralized facility and transported on the railroad, it really did seem to the local community like these women simply vanished into thin air.
It did. But the true smoking gun for genealogists isn't always the census. It's the property records.
Right, follow the money.
Always. Remember that a formal declaration of insanity triggered the legal appointment of a guardian. Now, in the Appalachian court system, this guardian was uniquely referred to as a committee.
A committee, like a one-person committee.
Yes. So a researcher might be looking at routine land beads, following the normal bureaucratic rhythm of an ancestor's life. Suddenly, the ancestor abruptly stops signing documents.
And instead?
Instead, you find a partition suit or a deed signed by her brother or the husband, acting as her committee. And the document will literally say he's selling her land because she is a lunatic confined in the state hospital.
Wow, it's just right there in ink. Or you might be looking at a mundane county tax list, and unexpectedly, a male relative is listed as paying taxes on behalf of his lunatic sibling.
Exactly. The sudden, unexplained appearance of a guardian or committee on a routine tax document is the smoking gun of institutionalization. The record of a massive family trauma is hiding in plain sight.
Uncovering that specific piece of paper is a breakthrough, but discovering the paperwork is only half the battle. Just because we find an official court document doesn't mean we should take its medical diagnosis at face value.
Not at all. In fact, this is where modern researchers often stumble. The sources outline 4 major mistakes genealogists make when interpreting these cases.
Let's go through them. What's the first pitfall?
The first is assuming the ancestor had a severe psychotic illness. A researcher finds an 1885 court document that says, insane, in big, bold letters, and they immediately assume their ancestor had something like schizophrenia.
When, given the finite energy theory we discussed, she was likely just experiencing a reframed biological state, like menopause or postpartum exhaustion.
Precisely. The second mistake is believing that the husband's initial petition to the court was an objective medical report.
Right. If a husband files a sworn complaint saying his wife is unmanageable and refuses to submit, that document is not clinical evidence.
It's a permanent record of a domestic conflict. It's his alibi.
And that leads directly to the third pitfall, treating labels like moral insanity or hysteria as clinical science. Modern researchers sometimes try to retroactively map these Victorian terms onto modern psychiatric manuals.
Which you just can't do. These diagnoses were entirely cultural judgments. They were punishments for violating the rigid social norms of the era, wrapped in the veneer of medical authority.
Yeah, I've always pushed back against the sanctity of historical records. An 1880s court document isn't an objective truth. It's just the winner's version of history, especially if the woman wasn't allowed to testify or legally defend herself.
I completely agree. And that brings us to the fourth pitfall. Simply missing the gendered power imbalance and systemic legal reality of the era.
Right. If you assume she had a fair trial, you're ignoring the mechanics of coverture and parens patriae. You're forgetting she was evaluated by a lay jury of men, legally empowered to strip her of her rights based on neighborhood gossip.
So if the surface-level diagnosis on the court document is inherently flawed, how do you verify what actually happened to her?
It requires rigorous, meticulous cross-referencing. You cannot rely on a single piece of paper.
You really have to build a 360-degree view of the motive. You start with the county court minutes to see the inquest and the verdict.
Then you locate the actual lunacy petition and read the witness statements.
Yeah.
You want to understand the social conflict that triggered the arrest.
Next, you track down the state hospital admission registers. What did the receiving doctors actually note when she arrived? Did they write down grief or menstrual derangement?
And finally, you go to the deed books and guardianship files. You follow the money. Who financially benefited from her removal?
This raises an important question about our relationship with history. Why do we put in this effort to dig up these painful, century-old family secrets?
Well, why do you think?
Because properly verifying these records allows modern people to correct false family narratives. It removes the shame that has hung over these families for generations.
That's a powerful way to look at it.
When we recognize that insanity was frequently just a social label applied to biological functions or inconvenient behavior, we restore these erased women to the historical record with the dignity they were denied in life.
To look at a blank space on a family tree and realize you didn't just disappear, you were pushed.
Exactly.
We started today looking for a vanishing ancestor. And what this deep dive has revealed is the complex, highly efficient machinery that swallowed her.
It was a perfect storm.
It really was. The legal system, operating through local clerks and parens patriae, combined with the deeply flawed medical theories of the 19th century and the harsh economic realities of rural Appalachian isolation. They all interlocked perfectly.
Turning normal female experiences into lock-and-key diagnoses.
It's a vital reminder to look past the family silences, to question the official ledgers, and to search for the shapes in the blank spaces.
You know, as we consider the specific mechanisms that silenced these women, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
I'd love to hear it.
We can look back at 19th century courts using concepts like finite nerve energy and moral insanity to lock away inconvenient citizens, and we easily recognize the absurdity of it, right?
Oh, absolutely. It seems ridiculous now.
We see exactly how medical language was drafted to solve a purely social or economic problem. But historical patterns rarely stay in the past. It forces us to examine our own era.
Oh, wow.
If they did it so easily back then, what behaviors or emotional states are we culturally pathologizing today simply because they disrupt our current social order?
That is a heavy, but incredibly necessary question to sit with. Who are we currently defining as the problem, just because they don't fit the machinery?
Exactly.
Well, thank you for joining us on this exploration today. Keep questioning the records, keep looking for the people who vanished, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.
Thank you for listening to this installment of the Appalachian Historical Review. Remember to visit the digital archive at AppalachianGenealogy.com. Join us next time for further study into the records and history of the Appalachian region.